and I'm starting to record it now. And so let me just start off with a really quick little poll that I can ask of you. And so let me display this poll for you. Yeah. So in a second, this poll should appear on your screen, and I'll just ask you to check which answer best describes your situation. Yeah. By the way, I want to emphasize that whenever I do these kinds of polls, I don't know what any one particular person said. I'm simply seeing the results of the poll in the aggregate. I'm not seeing what any one person said. Okay. So we'll just give people another minute to finish that. Most people have completed the poll, but not everybody has. Just another minute here. We're almost there, just waiting for one person to fill out the poll. So I'm gonna close that poll. Thanks for voting, and I'll share the results with you and just briefly mention them. So the results are that 8% of you, which is one of you, said that you get informal recognition 10 or more times a month. 2 of you said you never get it. Never, 0. The rest of you are split. 25% of people are getting it 5 to 9 times a month. 25% are getting it 3 to 4 times a month, and 25% are getting it 1 to 2 times a month. Now, keep that in mind. So, looks like, again, one of the things we've seen with this group, not surprising, very common, is that we get a real range here. We get some people aren't getting much positive recognition, and we get some people are getting a lot, and a lot of people spread out. Now, with that said, I want to give you, I want to do a second, a kind of a second poll, okay? So a very short one, and I'm going to launch this poll here. Sorry about this, very annoying. Okay. Okay, the poll should be opening up now. And so read the question. Tell me what you think. So everybody's voted on this. Let me tell you how it works out. 38% said yes. 46% said no. And 15% weren't sure. So hold that thought, because I want to start talking about at least what I mean by recognizing good performance. And again, I'm going to close that poll down right now, and I'll come back and mention it again in just a moment. All right, so at this point, with the poll closed down, you ought to be able to see my screen and see the slides. So let me go to the slides, and we'll talk about those a bit. Okay. So in order to talk about recognizing good performance, I need to just briefly introduce the concept of reinforcement and remind people what that term means. It's a term that's tossed around a lot, casually and often incorrectly. But we know from the work of behavioral psychologists around the middle and kind of the maybe 1940s, 50s, 60s, especially of the last century, and especially from the work of B.F. Skinner, we know that behavior that's rewarded is more likely to reoccur in the future. We know that behavior that is ignored is likely to disappear. That is, if you do something and it has no consequence at all to anybody, including to you, it's simply a behavior that has no consequence that's positive. Just nothing happens at all. Those kinds of behaviors tend to disappear. We also know that behavior that is punished, that is to say, is followed by something negative, is likely to disappear, but that only generally happens while the person's being monitored. In other words, you can punish a behavior, but it will often reoccur when the person feels that there's no opportunity to be punished because they're not being monitored. So this leads to the obvious question of what does it mean to what's a reinforcement? And the bottom line is there's no easy answer for that. You can never presume that you know what is rewarding to somebody else. Let me share a quick example of that. I worked with somebody for a number of years when I was at AT&T. A terrific person, a manager, second level manager there. And for a while she reported to me. She was an absolute delight to have reporting to me. Very bright, very conscientious, kind of person you could always count on. Just incredibly cooperative, just great, highest marks you could give. On several occasions, she had been offered a promotion to third level management. Now that's a hard promotion to get. Third level management is harder to get than second. And those of us who got there, our kind of assumption is, well, anybody who's offered that promotion would take it, right? Because they'd certainly find that promotion very rewarding. They'd see it as a positive reinforcement for their good behavior. But this woman declined the promotion. She'd been offered it several times over several years, and she declined it. And why? Well, because she didn't find it reinforcing. Her view was a promotion is going to be more work, more time at the office. I have a young child. I want to be home on time. My husband and I combined have a very nice income. We're very comfortable. I don't need the promotion financially. It's not going to enhance my life. I think it'll make my life worse. So what to many people was a reinforcement, to her was not. And we always need to think about the idea that whatever we find reinforcing might not be something other people find reinforcing. And understanding what other people find reinforcing can be really pivotal in acknowledging and recognizing good performance. Now, here's the next key point. And this goes back to my question about Lorraine. And for something to be reinforcement, it has to be contingent on performance. That is to say, the reinforcer only occurs when the positive behavior occurs. So imagine the distinction between a boss who's a very nice person, and we all applaud this boss. And this is a boss who brings in, donuts once a week, or cookies, or orders pizza for everybody once a week, and just is a really nice person. And that's all very positive, but that's not a reinforcement. And the reason why it's not a reinforcement is because it is not contingent on performance. So chances are Lorraine's behavior did not constitute a reinforcement because it was not contingent on performance. It was being very nice, but it was not rewarding a specific performance or acknowledging a specific performance. So reinforcement and contingency are really important, okay? This link between performance and the acknowledgement and the praise or the reward should be clear, okay? So keep that in mind, okay? It's not just being nice. Now, I want to talk about some different kinds of reinforcement briefly. The first is what is referred to as continuous reinforcement. And continuous reinforcement occurs whenever somebody is rewarded immediately every time they display a desirable behavior. They do something effective. They do something good. Every time. Now look at, that's highly unrealistic in real organizations. But if you can do that, or at least get close to that when people are learning new behavior or changing a behavior, that's really helpful. Because continuous reinforcement can really help people learn a behavior or change to a new behavior. But it's very difficult to sustain, nor do you need to sustain it. Of course, in most organizations, praise is not very frequent. Other important rewards like salary change only once a year, and performance feedback is fairly uncommon. So continuous reinforcement is often unrealistic, but something to keep in mind when you're trying to get somebody to adopt a new behavior or change a new behavior. The more you can reinforce it every time it occurs, the better initially. Doing that over the initial period of time. Intermittent reinforcement is much more common. This is where you're rewarding the behavior sometimes, but not always. It's a bit less predictable. It's something like the way a slot machine is. A slot machine intermittently rewards you if you play in a casino. You don't know when you'll get rewarded, although you can bet you will eventually get rewarded if you play long enough. You just don't know when. The reinforcement is intermittent. But intermittent reinforcement is really important for sustaining behaviors that have been well established. And this is why it becomes so important to not have to praise somebody every single time they do something right, but to look for opportunities to occasionally offer acknowledgement, praise, recognition, etc. Because if you're doing that, that kind of sustains those behaviors. And if other people hear that, by the way, it also has an effect on them. So this kind of intermittent reinforcement is important. Again, it needs to be contingent on the desired behavior. This next context is very important, which is referred to as observational or social learning. And this didn't come about from B.F. Skinner. It came about from later researchers who pointed out that the obvious, that humans aren't like rats. B.F. Skinner, he developed a lot of his principles by studying rats and pigeons, believe it or not, kind of amazingly enough. Kind of weird guy. But it turns out that rats and pigeons don't learn much by watching other rats and pigeons, but people do. So if people see somebody else getting reinforced for something, they're often inclined to start doing that behavior. I see Tony get reinforced for doing something. It makes it more likely that I'll do it, even though I was not reinforced. That is, the reinforcement of Tony is having an effect on me. That's referred to as observational or social learning. And again, this is a very powerful tool in organizations, right? And it also points out that when supervisors' words and actions are inconsistent, that people see that as being very hypocritical. So you're saying you're going to do this, but I saw that person exhibit some really desirable behavior. You did nothing. You said nothing. And therefore I learned, even though I never exhibited that behavior, I've learned, you know what? Why bother? Briefly, I want to talk about punishment. I'm not arguing that punishment should never be used. The issues of dealing with poor performance, that is the topic of our next homework assignment, not tonight's, but the one from early next week. Dealing with poor performance is, in essence, an issue of figuring out how to punish poor behavior. That's an unpleasant word for it, but that's really what it is, although we're not using that word. But the problem with punishment is that supervisors often allow some people more leeway than others, even though they commit the same poor performance. Supervisors also feel uncomfortable engaging in punishment or in any kind of disciplinary action, so they hesitate taking such action. And it builds up and it builds up, and the problem occurs again and again and again. And when the supervisor finally does act, they often react too harshly to the current violation. And of course, if you've ever worked for somebody who's just constantly negative, people just get used to it. it just becomes part of the background noise. Right? So punishment is not all that effective. It also requires your ability to monitor behavior to be effective, because you can't punish somebody if you can't monitor their behavior. And the bottom line is that's a hard thing to do. And punishment almost always leads to the recipient of that punishment trying to avoid the supervisor. It often leads them to become angry, and there's considerable research that anger leads to sabotage or retaliation in the workplace. So any kind of short-term improvement that accompanies punishment often is accompanied by some long-term side effects, such as anger, apathy, resentment, or frustration. So let's just talk about ways that we can recognize people in the workplace, and then I'm going to give you a little homework assignment that will just take you a couple minutes to do, and I'm just going to ask you to respond to it with an email sometime in the next 24 hours. So I'm not talking about anything big here. I'm talking about small things. Praise is, of course, the most common, but small things could really matter. A simple gift certificate, a dinner with that the employee could go to with the employee's spouse or partner, or passing along a compliment from a coworker. Employee of the month kinds of things. Some people really like those. Believe it or not, I've worked in places where getting a desirable parking space for a month is a huge reward, or getting a simple email of appreciation, especially if I copy your boss on it. The bottom line is this recognition needs to be tailored to the recipient. Okay, we need to understand and think about what will that person find to be a nice source of recognition. Now, let me show you one quick example of that, and then we'll kind of move on. When I was working for a guy many years ago, he was a great boss. He was actually 2 levels above me. He was kind of at the beginning of the executive level at AT&T, and he had asked me to work for him on a project, which took a lot of time over the course of a number of months, and there was no reduction in my normal workload, so it was all extra work. And he was a good guy to do this with. There was a lot of visibility. I got a chance to learn a lot, but it was definitely a lot of work. And one Monday, I came into my office. My office door is locked, and so I opened it up, and there was a letter on my desk. I knew I hadn't left a letter on my desk, and it just had my name on it, handwritten. And I opened up the letter, and it was a handwritten note from John, this executive. It was a short note, and it just said something like, Jim, I know you've put a lot of time in the last couple months. I'm really appreciative of everything you've done. I want to find a small way of saying thanks. To do that, I'd like you to take your wife out to a really nice dinner. Pick a great restaurant, have a great meal, buy a really terrific bottle of wine. Cost is no concern at all. So have a great meal, a great bottle of wine, enjoy yourselves. Send me the bill. I'll take care of it. Thanks a lot, John. Now, I don't know what that cost. In today's dollars, maybe that would have cost $250, $300 tops. Very upscale restaurant, nice bottle of wine, tip, etc. And compared to my salary, that's a small amount of money. But that gesture had a huge impact on me. Partly because he understood that by working so much time, I was taking time away from my wife. And therefore, he wanted to reward not just me, but he took the time to think that what would be good is to do something that would be rewarding for my wife, too, where she would really enjoy it. It's a great example of tailoring recognition to the recipient. So here's the little short assignment. By way of email, sometime in the next 24 hours, I just want you to send me 2 or 3 examples of recognition practices, anything, that are effective in your organization or could be effective in your organization. These could be things you've experienced, things that you've done. If possible, try to send some examples that aren't listed in these slides. If you can do that, that'd be great. So again, I'm not looking for a lot. I'm just looking for 2 or 3 examples from each one of you. Just a simple, quick email. I'm going to take them all together, cut and paste them without attribution as to who said what, put it in a single file and post it, and it can kind of serve as a master list or a menu of recognition practices that can serve as a resource for you as you seek to find kind of nice ways to recognize your colleagues at work. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about recognition. And with that in mind, I wanted to turn my attention to our second topic tonight, which is the topic of feedback. Okay? So this is pretty short. Let me get these slides up for you here. Okay, now, again, I just want to use a quick poll, and we'll see what you folks have to say about this, okay? Real quick question, and I'll post this poll. I'll launch it here, and then we'll give you a moment to respond to this, okay? So this is a question about how comfortable you are giving constructive negative feedback to people. I always ask this when I do this kind of thing. And again, if all of you can take a moment to respond to this, I will share our results, and then we'll kind of move forward. And almost everybody's voted. We'll just wait one more minute for our last votes to come in. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you. Here's what you folks said. Okay. Boy, this is really typical of this group, apparently. You're all over the map. 17% said you're very comfortable doing that. You're very comfortable sharing, providing constructive negative feedback. 33% of you said you're somewhat comfortable providing constructive negative feedback. 42% of you, that's the largest group, said you're somewhat uncomfortable providing constructive negative feedback. And 8% said you're very uncomfortable. This is, again, pretty typical. Half of you describe yourself as being on the uncomfortable side, half on the comfortable side. I have to say, I'm somebody who's taught this topic a lot and worked with people a lot on it, and I continue to have a mild level of discomfort whenever I have to do this. I'm not very uncomfortable because I have a framework for doing it, but I really do have this sense that I never do this kind of casually or with a great deal of comfort. I always worry a bit before I start to do it. Let's talk just a little bit about this idea of providing effective negative feedback. Okay, the first prerequisite is something I mentioned last night, which is that I've asked this question of tons of groups. The first time I ever asked this question, actually, was when a colleague and I were doing some consulting with Chase, now JP Morgan Chase. And we had been working with them for probably 6 months at least on a coaching program they had. And as part of that, we wound up interviewing some very senior people there. And very senior. I always kid that at JP Morgan Chase or any big bank like that, everybody's a vice president, you know. But these were, you know, really senior people. Kind of, I remember one of the women I interviewed was the corporate head of retail operations. It's a very senior position. So those are the kinds of people we're talking to, and we wound up asking them questions about times when they had been coached and times when they had received feedback, among many other questions. And it was interesting. All of them provided an answer that was kind of similar. And the biggest theme in their answers were that, this kind of negative constructive feedback, it was helpful if the person giving it to me had my welfare in mind. If they were doing it because they thought it was in my best interest. But if I think they don't care about me, this is just about whatever. They're getting this off their back, or they're just ticked off about something, well then, you know what? Their feedback's of no value to me. Again, this gets back to the idea that welfare, trust is really important. And that tells me something really important that I encourage you to keep in mind, which is that if you're going to be able to give constructive negative feedback, the person already has to have some confidence in you as being a good person who's thoughtful and listens and is the kind of person who's balanced, who often says nice things when they're deserved. And but at this moment, they're saying to something to me because it's in my best interest, and I think they actually care about me. You can't suddenly fake that. You can't suddenly make it happen. And what that means is that at the moment you go to give constructive negative feedback to somebody, the likelihood that you will be successful has in some substantial part been predetermined based on whether or not the person trusts you and has this confidence in your intent. So, a real quick reminder about the basic steps. I think all of you have had, or most of you have had MBA 810. I know some of you have because you took it with me, and in case you've forgotten. But many of the rest of you have probably also taken that course already. And this is some concepts that we tend to cover in this all the time. So what's the first challenge in giving constructive negative feedback? The first thing, and this is very simple, is to say to yourself, before you talk to the person, how am I going to describe what the behavior was? What behavior did I see? What was the situation? What was the event? What was the behavior? I want to find a simple, direct way of describing that behavior. I don't want to make any accusations. I'm simply describing the behavior. That's what I'm going to do. That's how I'm going to start. I'm not going to make any inference about the person's motives. I don't want to make any reference to their personality. I just want to describe the behavior. This is a really simple example at the bottom of this slide. The second thing I want to do is I want to describe why it matters. Why am I reacting to this? Why am I concerned about it? What are the consequences of what happened? And therefore, why is it of concern? And why am I talking to you about it? You ought to be able to prepare to say both of these things before you talk to somebody. Very few people are good enough to just wing it. Okay, to just get up and wing it. So it's helpful to think in advance, how am I going to describe what happened? I'm not going to make any comments about personality or motives or anything like that. And why does it matter to me? Let me practice saying that. You ought to be able to say all of that probably in 30 seconds or less, 1 minute at the most. Third, quit talking about the past and start talking about the future. This is really important because the more you talk about what happened, the more defensive the person is going to get. So quit talking about who's right or who's wrong. You said what happened. You described why you're concerned about it. Let's talk about how things can work going forward. What can you do in the future? What can happen now? What are some alternatives? It seems to me that it would be ideal if you can at least be thoughtful enough to have one suggestion or one alternative that you can offer, but you shouldn't presume that it's the only alternative. So here you have to have a two-way discussion. So at this point, the key features at step 3, two-way discussion, and you're focused on the future. You've stopped talking about the past. The person will be much more comfortable while you're doing this than if you keep hanging on and dwelling on the past. After that discussion's done, you're at a point where the person has heard a brief description of what happened in an objective way without any discussion of personality or motives. 2, they've got a sense as to why you're concerned about it. And 3, they've had a chance to talk about how to handle things going forward in a more constructive way, and they've had a chance to offer their own thoughts about that, and you've had a chance to offer some kind of a useful suggestion yourself. And at the end, we want to summarize what's happened. Now, let me kind of come back to this idea that I talked about before about inferences. The worst thing you can do when you're giving negative feedback to somebody is to make an inference. So imagine I say to somebody, you don't care what I think. Well, that's an inference. You don't actually know what's inside the person's head. Instead of saying you don't care what I think, you're much better off asking yourself, what did the person do, or what did the person not do that has led me to conclude that that person doesn't care what I think? And instead of saying, you don't care what I think, I will describe what they did or what they didn't do. So it's perfectly fine to say to somebody, you didn't ask for my opinion, because that's an objective description of a behavior. In this case, a behavior that didn't occur, but it's still an objective description of a behavior. But you don't care what I think is an inference. It's about something that's going on in the person's mind. And if you make that inference, you lose, because the person's going to say, that's not true, I do care what you think. And you're going to say, well, I don't think so. And the person will say, well, I do. And this argument's going no place at this point. Well, this is also extremely true in our personal lives as we interact with partners, spouses, friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, children, parents, etc. Avoid the inference. Here's another inference. It seemed to me that you wanted all the credit for yourself. Well, that's an inference. You don't know that unless the person said it. Now, what led you to that inference? Well, maybe the person never mentioned the other team members during a presentation. Okay, well, say that. Say the behavior that led you to the inference. Never say the inference. I'm not arguing you shouldn't make inferences, by the way. I want to be really clear. People make inferences all the time. It's a really common thing. I'm just saying you shouldn't say them out loud. Because when you do, you lose, and your ability to give constructive negative feedback collapses and goes off track. You make the person defensive and argumentative. So anytime you make an inference about somebody's motives, you're almost guaranteeing some kind of a defensive response to the feedback. Okay? So in sum, we've got these 4 basic steps that somebody can use as a framework for providing negative feedback. Now, I want you to keep these steps in mind, because remember, one of the homework assignments is going to be about dealing with poor performance. Now, there's a bunch of other slides that are going to be on, that are already on Canvas about dealing with poor performance. But obviously, a central piece of dealing with poor performance is having conversations with employees where there are problems and providing constructive, effective feedback. And this simple framework, it provides kind of a context. It doesn't provide the exact words you should use. That's crazy. You have to have your own language, your own style. But it can provide a context about how to go about doing that and how you can prepare to do that effectively. Okay. So those are my goals for tonight. And with that said, I want to pause and ask if anybody has any questions. If you do, you can unmute yourself and speak, or you can type me a note. Okay. Everybody's good with that so far, sounds like. So you've got one more poll to respond to, okay? Last poll of the evening. And this is just some quick feedback for me on this very, very short session that we had tonight. And that's kind of a reminder and hopefully a clarification about what reinforcement is, and some framework about providing useful negative feedback, okay? So our poll has been launched. If you can respond to the poll, that'd be great, and again, be very helpful to me. And almost everybody's voted. We'll just give it one more moment to do that. Okay, so thanks for that feedback. That's very helpful. Remember, we're going to have an online session tomorrow because of the confusion and threat about snow here. So what's due tomorrow? Somebody asked. is the only thing that's due tomorrow is you just need to get back to me with those 2 or 3 examples of informal recognition practices from your workplace by way of email. But again, there is homework, and the homework is posted on Canvas. And that homework is about the assigned reading, not about this. The assigned reading, I think, is pretty straightforward, and that you don't have to get to me until Sunday. Okay, does that answer that question? Okay, so thanks everybody. I promised you that we wouldn't exceed 45 minutes tonight, and it was 41 minutes, so I think I kept my promise. I'm glad of that, and I am appreciative, and I will see you all on Saturday at 10 o'clock, and I will be with you all again tomorrow briefly at 6, from 6 to 6:45, okay? Again, I'll send the link by way of an announcement. Have a great night. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.